As we continue our study of the book of Genesis, we now come to the last part of chapter 31 and chapters 32 and 33. As we look at the story now, we come to probably one of the points of highest tension within the entire narrative in the entire book of Genesis, at least the story of Abraham, because at this point now we see what appears to be the greatest threat to the people of Israel, people of Jacob, as it begins here. And there are really three threats that we see. First of all, the threat of Laban, who's chasing Jacob from behind. And then the threat from God himself, as this human wrestles with Jacob, and yet he feels like he is wrestling with one who is from God, or a form of God himself. One cannot tell from the text real clearly. And thirdly, he has the threat of Esau in front of him. And we remember that as Jacob fled and had gone to Bethel and had at that time seen this vision of the angels of God ascending and descending, and all of the promise that God gave him, that he would keep the promise to Grandpa Abraham and to his father Isaac, that there would be a blessing. The real question now is, how is that blessing going to be carried out? In the last section, of course, Jacob, whose name means crooked one, as we've talked about, is being tricked and is experiencing from Uncle Laban, from his father-in-law, what he himself had done to Esau. And so there's a kind of a way in which the sins that he's carried out against Esau in stealing the birthright come home to roost. And yet in the entire story, Jacob is going to say that he was just perfectly on top of everything, and he did everything just right, and puts Laban, his father-in-law, in the wrong. So at the beginning of the story now, we have Jacob, who has been with his uncle Laban for 20 years and feels that he now has no important place, deciding, because of the insistence of God, and note the text says that God came and said, okay, now it's time to go back, that he now says to his wives, this is what my God said to me, what do you want to do? And the two wives and the two concubines go along, and their 12 children. Remember that Benjamin has not been born yet to Rachel, but that we do have Joseph already born, and the 12th child is Dinah, about whom we'll speak in the very next section beginning next time. But as the story develops now, Jacob has fled. The general conclusion from the legal material would be that Jacob came with nothing, and that at best he had the right to have a family while he was there, but if he left, he would leave with nothing. The girls say that their bride price, the amount of money that Jacob earned for their father while he was working for him for the 14 years, has all been used up, or most likely simply stashed away, so the girls will not get it anymore. They figure after 20 years that gift won't come back, and so they say, why bother staying with our father? So there is an underlying tension here, underlying tension that seems to have been in this family for a long time. The girls do not seem in any way to say, we really are going to miss our father. Mother is never mentioned, but the tension now with the father and the brothers who are off doing the sheep shearing is now brought to a head, and they decide it's time for them to leave. So Jacob packs everything up and he leaves. Obviously, he is looking for a moment when he can kind of sneak away, and so the trickster is still up to his tricks in a certain sense. He tells Laban, when Laban finally catches up with him in Gilead, which is kind of just north and east of the Sea of Galilee. It's almost all the way back to the land that Jacob had come from. He will say to his father-in-law that he was afraid, and thus he thought that he better leave when he had the chance. But as Laban catches up with him, the night before, God appears to him. And we have kind of a mixed signal here about exactly what understanding someone like Laban would have of the God who appeared to Jacob. The family of Abraham, which would have been the uncle of Laban, that family was told that they would have this land of Canaan, that they would inherit everything, and that God would watch over them. And obviously that's the undercurrent of the entire story, that we have a covenant here, a promise that God had made to Abraham, and apparently had renewed to Isaac, though we don't have as much of a clarity about that, but now had promised also to Jacob as he encouraged him when he left, with the words that he would come back once again. And so this whole kind of a setting now is the background where Jacob is really questioning God 3 times. Once with Laban, once with the wrestling, and once with Esau. Are you really going to keep the promise to me that you made? You've given me the things. You've given me the children. But now are you going to be a protector for me? And the answer, of course, every time is yes. The human odds always show that Jacob should have lost. Laban comes with a legal and powerful position to pursue what was in essence a runaway slave. The man from God, the human being with whom he wrestles when he says, I've seen God face to face, obviously has the power to kill him if he will. And Esau, with his 400 men, could do the same. And Jacob knows very clearly that the little bit of a family that he has and the unprotected flocks and herds are not going to be enough to ward off Esau coming with 400 men. And those 400 men, then they disappear. There's never anything said about them in terms of why he would have come with so many. We might remember that Abraham had 318 men when he went into battle against those 4 kings of southern Iraq from Shinar, who had stolen Lot and then the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim. So this is obviously a force that was strong enough to be able to wage battle. Go back to the story of Laban now. As Laban catches up with Jacob, he says, if your God hadn't talked to me last night, I would have all the rights to be able to take you away and or take your family away and take them back, but your God told me not to harm you, and so I will respect that. But 2 matters have to be settled. First of all, the matter of the household gods. Older traditions and older explanations of this suggested that the woman or the person who had the household gods would be able to claim the right of inheritance of the property. And there may be a little bit of this involved in that, but newer scholarship has sort of questioned that. In some way, shape, or form, there is a kind of a laugh that comes forth here in the story that Laban's gods haven't really done a very good job of protecting him, since they themselves got stolen as well. So whether it would be the right of inheritance later, or simply this idea that the household gods weren't really able to do the job and are themselves stolen away, is one part of it. The other part is, as Rachel says to her father, I'm in the heavy part of my period and I can't get up. The Jews would have really laughed every time they would have heard that story about the fact that an impure or unclean woman at this time, as she was considered because of the flow of blood, would not or would be sitting on somebody else's gods and deities, which were thereby also shown to be ineffective, that they couldn't even get themselves away from such a situation. So Jacob, who obviously loves Rachel very dearly, puts himself in a very exposed position, and Rachel on her own is getting back at her father for this. Remember also that this says that if there were household gods, if there were these little household deities in Laban's house, that we are not dealing with someone who is worshiping Yahweh in the same way that we might expect that someone who knew this same God would have. So we're talking in a world of polytheism here. The other part of the story is that Laban says, let's draw a line in the sand and decide where you're going to stay and where I'm going to stay. Laban lives in a land that's called Syria today. That was called Aram. The word Aramaic comes from that. That was the language spoken there. And So even the name of that pile of stones is given here in Aramaic as well as in Hebrew. It's the only Aramaic words in the book of Genesis. There's sort of a reflection of what does happen later, because in much later times, particularly after the death of Solomon in the 920s, which of course is maybe 6, 7, 800 years after this, after the death of Solomon, the people from that region, from up in Aram in Syria, did come and indeed were the major conquering and occupying force for about the next 125 years after that. So that covenant that was issued between Laban and Jacob way back when was not held to in later times, as is very typical of most promises. So they stay in the region east of the Jordan, and they make this treaty. Laban hugs and kisses all of his family members, and then he makes his way back, and we never hear of them ever crossing paths again. One would think that in the midst of some of these family stories that there would have been some news going back and forth. Esau, would he not have known that his brother was living with the uncle, and would they not have ever wanted to find out what happened to him, to hear something about what had become of him in those 20 years? And so there's a lot of loose ends to the story as well. But as Jacob then prepares to cross the Jabbok, which is one of the rivers, it's one of the streams that flows from east to west and runs into the Jordan River. It's really a very steep area, and the fall of the land is down, I would imagine, right by the Jordan, a couple 100 feet, if memory serves me right. It's quite a steep drop, and as we were in a bus traveling along that area and crossing over the Jordan, I remember looking way down at the Jabbok, and it's quite a ways down. So he is carefully bringing all his flocks down this hill, and they have a ford, a place that's shallow enough that they can get across, and then they get to the other side. And the story says that Jacob has divided his family into two groups, one with each of the wives, and then with the servant girl, and dividing all of his flocks and herds so that hopefully he will not be completely wiped out, and so they must separate to some extent. And then he stays by that Jabbok and will cross over the next morning. As the night events unfold at the end of this chapter, then we have this whole story about Jacob wrestling with God. Um, there are all sorts of different theories about what this means, and people have looked at stories in other religions about the terrors of the night and people who go through the anguish at nighttime, and the tossing and turning and the wrestling, and that there were also those who in the terrors of the night actually were attacked by others who some even talk about demonic forces that would have to disappear when the sun came up. And so we're in a realm where there's more going on than we can really recover. But the main event, the main thing that seems to be going on here as Jacob wrestles with God, or with this human being as it says in the story, is that he is now seeking to find out just exactly will God continue to bless him or not. He has heard this promise from God back in the beginning, and now as we come to the second of these three stages in the story, the third one being, of course, the confrontation with Isaac, really the most important event has to take place. Will God destroy him? Will God keep that promise, or will God say, that's the end of it? He can be protected by God from Laban and from Esau, but what is he going to do before God directly? And that really is the question that comes for every human being. This is, of course, the time when the name Israel appears, and with just a very slight variation in the vocabulary. The word Jacob, remember, means crooked, and when he was a crooked fella, he walked straight on two legs. Now, as he goes through this wrestling, and there is something that happens to his hip or his thigh, and it's thrown out of joint, and he cannot walk straight, then as he is given the name Straight One in Yisrael. The word Yashar with a kind of an SH sound in it, Yashar El, means one who's walking straight or right on with God. So when he could walk upright, he was crooked. Now when he has to limp, then he is given a name of someone who is straight with God, using the generic word El and not the word Yahweh, of course. So a new name is given to sort of give an explanation why are these called the people of Israel and not the people of Jacob. And the result of this is that he gives his name and gets a new one, but he does not hear from this being that he is wrestling with what that individual's name is. But yet he calls the name Peniel or Penuel, which means the face of God, in pretty much both of those meanings. So he survives that. He crosses the Jabbok then, finally having heard from God in as direct a confrontation as we're going to get, that God will bless him even though he had stolen the birthright and stolen the blessing earlier. Then we have this one further problem that is just as significant for him, and which I'm sure was on his mind that night as well. Here comes Esau with 400 men. And as Esau comes, Jacob kind of rearranges it. It sounded at first like he had two whole different companies that had been split, but now as he is marching, he puts the two servant girls and their children, Zilpah and Bilhah, at the front, and then Leah and her 6 children, and then keeps Rachel and Benjamin toward the back. And so it's almost as if he changes tactics or whatever. And then he goes to meet Esau, bowing 7 times down, to try to show how he is subservient to him, hoping maybe that he can earn some favor, giving him a very special gift, in essence trying to buy him off, trying to give him a bribe, divert his attention from the wickedness of 20 years ago when he stole the birthright, by giving him a blessing and saying, you, sir, you, my older twin brother by a few minutes, are the more important one, and I'm less important. Esau, at this point, apparently calls it quits and says that he will forget what has happened, and he hugs his brother and asks about who all of the family members are. And then Jacob says, no, I want to force this gift on you. I want to make sure you take it. And that's probably very typical Mideastern kind of bartering that's going on at that point. Esau is going to take that gift anyway, and he's probably very happy to make Jacob crawl a little bit, and may have come there simply to rub in what had happened. We'll find out later that the boys later still bury their father, so the division of property hasn't taken place yet, but Esau obviously is rather well-to-do if he has all of this income. So as they part, Esau says, now how about you coming south with me? And of course Esau goes to the region of Edom, which is east of the Dead Sea, and Jacob says, well, it's going to take my family a little bit of time to make the journey, so you go on ahead. And Esau says, well, why don't I leave a few of my men with you to help you along the way? And he says, no, I want to trust my God that he will get me to where I'm going. But then as Esau heads directly south, Jacob heads west and crosses the Jordan and goes into the region of Shechem, which is north of Jerusalem, quite a bit north of where they had lived with their father Isaac down in Beersheba. And we never hear, except for the burial of their father, that the two ever had any dealings after that. The story of Esau, or the Edomites, as they are called, of course, will show up in many later history stories in the Old Testament, and the Edomites will be very unkind to the people of Jerusalem when the city is burned down, and they turn in those who had fled and turn them into the Babylonians, but that's going to be again something that comes many centuries later. So this threat, this probably greatest threat in the book of Genesis to the promise, the fear that Laban could take all of the children away, which would leave Jacob with no one to have as a descendant and an heir to inherit the land, and with Esau, who could kill all of the family members again, and Jacob himself, and then the wrestling with God, all kind of reach their conclusion in God showing, though he is not directly talking except maybe through the blessing of that wrestling event, that God will be with him. As we continue the story, it is really still the story of God loving sinners, working with them, caring for them. And as we continue to see the story unfold, we'll see that there will be many other tensions that will come up in the story, and God will once again have to love those who are not everything that he made them to be. Thank you for your continued study, and God's blessing.